Over the past year, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led countries around the world to hit back at Putin with wave after wave of economic sanctions. You've probably seen the news: governments freezing Russian assets, banning exports, cutting off imports, restricting flights, and sanctioning Russian oligarchs. And to be honest, the goal isn't a mystery. We can safely say it's to punish Putin by crippling Russia's economy. So far, Russia has been hit with over 16,000 sanctions, becoming the most sanctioned country in the world, more than Iran or Venezuela, according to data from Castellum. In fact, just a few days ago, the US announced 500 new sanctions against Russia in response to the tragic death of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Navalny died in a Russian prison on February 16th after being imprisoned for his political activism against Putin's regime. His death sparked international outrage and calls for accountability. As President Biden stated via the Washington Post, these sanctions will target individuals connected to Navalny's imprisonment, as well as Russia's financial sector, defense industrial base, procurement networks, and sanction evaders across multiple continents. They will ensure Putin pays an even steeper price for his aggression abroad and repression at home. The new US sanctions are intended to punish those responsible for Navalny's death and the systemic repression in Russia, while also continuing to pressure Russia's economy. The US and its allies hoped these moves would devastate Russia's economy and turn citizens against the invasion. But here's the thing: despite all of these sanctions raining down, Russia's economy actually grew after initial declines. In fact, as reported in the Financial Times, its economy grew faster than the G7 last year and is forecast to do so again this year. So, did the sanctions really have the devastating impact the West intended? Or did they backfire, hurting the US and Europe economically while failing to stop Putin's aggression in Ukraine? In this video, we'll be examining the real economic impacts on both sides of this huge global experiment in sanctions. We'll analyse how sanctions have affected Russia's trade, currency, oligarchs, public opinion, and so on, while examining their unintended consequences, such as soaring energy prices in Europe. At the end of this video, you will better understand whether these historic sanctions have proven effective at deterring Russia's invasion, or if their complex ripple effects mean that there is a need to rethink parts of this sprawling sanctions regime. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Back in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in a shockingly violent attack that reverberated around the world. In response, countries including the US, UK and EU united to punish Russia's unprovoked aggression through intense economic sanctions. The goal was straightforward: cripple Russia's economy to pressure Putin to end the war. But nearly 2 years later, Russian troops still occupy parts of Ukraine, which raises a critical question: have these sanctions worked as intended? Let's break this down step by step, starting with how the sanctions have damaged Russia's economy. The Oxford Dictionary defines sanction as an official order that limits trade, contact, etc. with a particular country in order to make it do something such as obeying international law. So they are basically punitive measures used to force compliance with rules or policies. They can target an entire country, like the broad sanctions on Russia, or specific groups, sometimes called smart sanctions. Countries sanction other countries to punish, deter future acts, push rehabilitation, or restrain capacity to act. On the 24th of February 2022, the first major sanctions, known as the EU package sanction, targeted nearly 1,950 individuals and entities in Russia, restricting their financial access and measures. This was just the beginning of a cascade of economic sanctions. Initially, these sanctions appeared utterly devastating. The Russian stock market plunged over 30%, and the value of the ruble crashed nearly 40% against the US dollar. Major rating agencies downgraded Russia's debt to junk status, and about $300 billion of Russia's piles of foreign currency reserves were abruptly frozen abroad. Russia was also kicked out of the SWIFT global banking system, cutting off access to financial networks. Transactions from major cards like Visa and MasterCard? Yep, those were blocked too. You'd think it stopped there, but it didn't. An exodus of over 1,000 international companies withdrawing from Russia compounded the economic chaos. No more Big Macs or Starbucks, no more Pepsi or Coca-Cola. But here's the plot twist. Russia took steps to patch holes and prop up its economy. Russia's central bank raised interest rates sharply. Strict controls on money moving in and moving out were put in place to steady the ruble, which bounced back after initially plunging. Russia also tapped into its massive cash reserves worth over $600 billion to increase government spending. It heavily relied on over $700 billion in revenue from stable energy exports to cushion the sanctions' impact. In fact, in the first 100 days of the invasion, Russia earned nearly $100 billion from oil and gas exports, more than many of the EU countries. Its ruble also climbed to over 90 against $1, the strongest level since 2022. While Russia's GDP did shrink by over 2% in 2022, it's now projected to grow by around 1.1% in 2024, according to the IMF. Much better than the total collapse some experts predicted, right? This unexpected turnaround in growth likely prompted Putin's claim that sanctions had zero effect. But don't take Putin at his word. Underneath the surface, there's real economic pain and disruption for Russian businesses and consumers. Though I will say the effects are nothing compared to what anyone would have expected. For instance, when import bans were enacted, technologies like computer chips and everyday goods many Russians relied on suddenly dried up. Store shelves once filled with familiar Western products were now bare. Popular fast foods like McDonald's disappeared almost overnight. However, Russia worked creatively to fill some critical gaps. China exported more cars and smartphones to meet demand. Turkey became a backdoor for sanctioned Western goods entering illegally through black markets. For oil exports, Russia used underground networks of tankers to secretly maintain some sales off the books. Even though sanctions directly hurt the finances and connections of the average Russian, especially through restrictions placed on Western bank accounts and credit cards, they soon adapted creatively. For example, alternative local bank cards and payment systems emerged to fill gaps. Sberbank and domestic alternatives like MirPay cards expanded banking options, reaching unprecedented success. For instance, Sberbank reported a 64% year-over-year increase in net profit in 2021, with return on equity increasing from 24.2% from 16.2%. Travel bans also stopped Russians from easily visiting Europe for business or vacations. No more romantic weekend Paris getaways or beach holidays in Spain. However, destinations like Maldives, Turkey, and the UAE welcomed an influx of Russian tourists. This means where some countries lost, other countries actually gained. Domestically, shortages of imported goods like machinery and consumer products also emerged. Medicines became scarcer with pharmaceutical companies exiting, and Russia's military mobilization sucked up government spending, causing cuts to healthcare and education budgets. Still, most Russians adapted to the new normal as domestic substitutes popped up and shelves were restocked with Asian imports. What about Russians rising up against Putin in protest? It happened, but it wasn't as expected due to Putin's dictatorship. State propaganda spun the sanctions as an attack on the Russian people, rallying nationalist support. If you ask conservative Russians about the war, they're undecided, except the liberal ones who know deep down that Putin is a dictator. And, if anything, the death of Navalny has shown that Putin should prepare for many more Navalnys. Navalny's burial attracted thousands of Russians mourning for him, laying flowers at the Moscow monument. This can be interpreted as the biggest gathering of people supporting opposition to Putin since 2011. Right now, however, we can safely say Russia is adjusting. But the big question is, for how long can that last? Already there are signs of strain. Health and education budgets face dramatic cuts while small businesses struggle to access loans and support. This paints a more nuanced picture that Putin's claim that the sanctions have zero effect. There has been some economic damage, although considerably less than what the West must have hoped for. Russia adapted through aggressive policy responses. No sanctioned country has weathered such economic barriers as resiliently as Russia. Makes you wonder, who really bears the burdens or costs of these sanctions? Russia? Or the nations that impose them? So let's shift gears a little bit and explore how sanctions have boomeranged back on the countries that impose them, especially in the EU and the UK. Consider these scenarios. In 2022, Russia's GDP shrank around 2% under sanctions pressure. However, it also earned over $100 billion from oil and gas exports alone to cushion the impact. Forecasts estimate that Russia's economy will rebound nearly 1.1% in 2024 despite sanctions remaining. Meanwhile, in Europe, sanctions boomeranged back painfully. With 35% of Europe's Russian gas supplies cut off by Russia through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, import costs skyrocketed over 650%, moving from €20 in 2021 to €150 in 2022. Energy bills are tough in Germany. Millions struggle to afford heating, fuel, and electricity. Beyond energy, sanctions also disrupted grain exports from Ukraine that fed the world, leaving developing nations particularly suffering the knock the most. Price shocks sparked protests and political instability that Russia exploited to increase its influence. Currently, over 4 African nations have abandoned democracy, switching to military rule with Russia's backing. So, while Russia's economy took a modest hit, Europe and the UK face recession, energy rationing, and dangerous levels of inflation thanks in part to their own sanctions designed to deter Russia. A difficult trade-off, if you ask me. Speaking of inflation, rising prices have squeezed Europeans across the board. For example, in the UK, inflation hit a 40-year high of 11.1% last year. High energy bills played a major role in this. The Eurozone also saw inflation, causing a cost of living crisis for millions. Higher prices have driven strikes and protests across Europe as people demand pay hikes to keep up. This is especially the case for farmers, whose protest seems to have no end. Economically, sanctions may shrink the GDP of European nations by over 1%, according to estimates. That's hundreds of billions in lost output and growth, a heavy price for the European public to bear. Initially, most Europeans strongly supported sanctions to punish Russia for invading Ukraine, but as economic costs pile up, fatigue and doubts continue to set in. Recent polls show that Germans want diplomacy, not more sanctions. Other surveys find support for sanctions wavering. Beyond direct costs, sanctions have caused unintended harm to Europe, like refugee inflows from Ukraine. Cutting off cultural and educational ties between Europe and Russia has also been questioned. There are also concerns that weaponizing the global financial system through sanctions could backfire in the long term. Echoes of the post-World War I sanctions on Germany come to mind, breeding resentment and radicalism. The energy crisis has forced Europe to scramble towards uncertain alternatives like importing more American gas. Sanctions expose the risks of relying on adversaries for essential imports, a harsh geopolitical lesson. While initially able to absorb the costs, it remains to be seen how long European unity on sanctions can hold as economies falter. For Russia, sanctions damage, but adjustment continues. For Europe, it's increasing pain without promised results. This complex equation of impacts on both sides raises tough questions going forward. One major question is, to sanction or not to sanction? That's been a big debate ever since this crisis began. Proponents of sanctions, like foreign policy hawks, will tell you sanction is the best way to pressure countries economically without war. They point to cases like Iran, where sanctions brought leaders to negotiate. But success is not universal, and even we can't call that success since the strain between Iran and the West continues to widen. For Russia, some experts argued that sanctions were the best way to stop Putin without direct conflict. Hit his wallet and the oligarchs will force him to back down. Others argued sanctions could actually backfire and turn Russians against the West while barely denting Putin's control. Not to mention we, you and me who had nothing to do with this war, will suffer too. Those in favour said rising costs would turn Russians against the invasion once food shortages hit and their vacation plans got ruined. But opponents said Putin would spin sanctions as an attack on Russia itself, rallying people behind him more. And it seems they were right if you consider what's happening today and how Putin is actually going about the war. Either way, the US, Europe and allies moved forward with sanctions anyway to take a stand against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The results have been mixed. Russia took an economic hit but bounced back quicker than expected. For average Russians, sanctions upended daily life, but loyalty to Putin didn't really waver. Europe got slammed with higher energy bills and inflation. Though willing to shoulder costs initially, patience seems to be wearing thin and citizens are becoming wary of many sanctions by the day. So, were these sanctions actually worth it? Like most things, there are good arguments on both sides, but the truth is, the long-term impacts remain to be seen. Some say sanctions prevented an even worse scenario without a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. Others say they needlessly hurt Europe while failing to stop Putin. See, you can debate the merits of the sanctions forever, but it's hard to argue they achieved the primary goal of stopping the war so far, even though they did inflict damage on Russia. The big takeaway is that sanctions are messy. They come with unintended costs and unintended consequences. There are no easy solutions in situations like this, but hopefully an honest look at the outcomes so far, good and bad, can further thoughtful discussion on whether the current sanctions policy is working. Now, away from us and back to you, what do you think? Was sanctioning Russia the right call? Or did the costs outweigh any benefits? Don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments. There's undoubtedly a lot more to explore on this complex topic, and we'll be sure to stay on top of the evolving sanctions debate. But before then, as always, thanks for being part of the conversation. Until next time, stay curious.